What's up, everybody? In this video, I'm going to talk about some tips I have for working with things like ChatGPT. What I'm really talking about is working with large language models and getting them to kind of do what you're trying to do. With that said, let's jump right into it. I'll be honest, I was skeptical about how useful large language models would be, especially at first. I remember using BERT, this was back before ChatGPT came out, and I was certainly impressed, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near the capabilities of what's available today. Now, even ChatGPT when it came out, I was certainly impressed, but I wasn't blown away. But now that I kind of know how to prompt these large language models effectively, I certainly am blown away, and I can see a lot of opportunity for automation of different tasks. All right, so for today, I'm going to give you 5 powerful techniques for making the most of large language models. These are tips and tricks I picked up while working on developing applications that depend on large language models. If you stick around to the end, I'll even give a bonus tip. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, let's jump into tip number 1. My first tip is for whatever problem you're trying to solve using large language models, see if you can break it up into a bunch of smaller problems. All right, let's jump into tip number 1. My first tip is if you have some sort of problem that you're trying to solve using large language models, try to break it up into smaller problems. Large language models, at least from what I've seen, are really good at small, well-defined tasks. But they can kind of struggle if your task is too complex or contains too many steps. So what I would recommend is actually just break your problem up, input each problem separately into the LLM, and get the response, and then work from there. Now, if you work like this, it's a bit easier to debug. So why is this? Well, really, if you have a bunch of smaller tasks that the LLM is working on, you can analyze its response to each one separately. So if it's failing on a particular task, you can focus in on that one rather than trying to debug the whole system in its entirety. Now, I will say, figuring out the correct subtask or subproblem could be pretty hard. And, well, it doesn't have to be super hard, but it can take some sort of creativity to figure out, this is how I should think of this problem so that the LLM can solve it correctly. So I will say that. But yeah, in conclusion, if you can break your problem into a bunch of smaller problems that, should be, give your LLM a better opportunity to go ahead and solve those smaller problems and then combine them into one big solution. All right, so my second tip for you is something called Kshot Prompting. So suppose we have some problem we're trying to solve using large language models. Now, what we're going to do is provide some additional context in the actual question that we're... All right, so my second tip for... All right, so my second tip for you is something called Kshot Prompting. So suppose we have some problem we're trying to solve using large language models. What we're going to do is provide some additional context in hopes that it'll make the model perform better. So what is this additional context going to be? Well, in this case, we're going to actually provide a bunch of completed examples of the given task we're working on. So we might provide 1 example or 10 examples or something like this of sample problems that are similar to the one you're trying to solve with the completed solution. At the very end of all that, we'll ask our question and hope for the correct response. Now, what this does is it really improves the accuracy of the models. Many people have observed this, and I've observed this as well. And also, as a byproduct, something a little different, it actually improves the formatting of the response. So if you've ever worked with large language models, you might notice that they kind of add a bunch of superfluous text sometimes to maybe explain what's going on or just say, hey, thanks for the question, here's the response. And if you don't really want that, this Kshot Prompting can help get rid of that. So now let's have a look at this table that I have. So I kind of grabbed this table from a technical report from Google. So this is their paper on Palm 2, which is one of their large language models. So this table was particularly kind of interesting to me, not for the reason that they kind of presented in the paper. So in the paper, they're kind of comparing PaLM and PaLM 2. So that's, two of their large language models, and they're trying to say, hey, look, PaLM 2 is much more impressive than PaLM, and here, this is why. That's kind of the point of this table. But anyway, so what is going on with this table? So it's kind of like a toxicity classification. So they're basically trying to say like, hey, given a comment, how toxic is it, or is it toxic at all? And can you please, provide that response, LLM? And the LLMs do pretty well on this task. As you can kind of see, the numbers are, close to 100, which is good, not perfect. But one thing that I think is interesting, and one thing I kind of want to highlight, is on the left they have 0 shot. So that's if they don't provide any completed examples of this task. And on the right they have 10 shot. So they provide 10 completed examples of this task. And you can see that for both models on the left, the numbers are lower than on the right. So in particular, the Kshot Prompting is doing quite a bit better. So that's pretty interesting. The task here is pretty concrete. You just have to determine if something is toxic or not. And we can already see that, the tool itself, the large language model, is more capable of doing this than you might originally think from just asking it. So that's kind of interesting. And this isn't the only table out there that exists. I just kind of grabbed one at random. But this kind of illustrates the point that Kshot prompting can be a useful trick. All right, so now let's talk about reflection. So in reflection, your original setup, you just ask your prompt and get a response, is completely the same. However, once you get the response, you might ask a follow-up prompt asking the LLM to say, hey, look at the response, look at the original question, and kind of reflect on this. And reflection might be, can you catch errors, or is this right, or can you improve it, or stuff like this. So one maybe common use case of this might be, suppose you're trying to have it generate code. Now, if you want to run this code, of course it has to be completely correct, and if there's, even if there's one character off, one word off, it's not going to work. So reflection could be a powerful tool to have the large language model go through the code and make sure that, hey, it looks good. So this is reflection. It's a pretty powerful technique in terms of just kind of catching errors and improving the response. Oh, so by the way, in that previous slide, there was an image, and that image was generated using AI. Now, there was a problem. If you look close at it, you can actually see there was an extra arm in the image. So what I did was, input the image back into the AI, and also I asked it to, hey, make sure there's only 2 arms, and can you generate something kind of similar? And so what I got is this picture here. So that's actually some sort of reflection, if you think about it. All right, so my next tip is to use something called retrieval augmented generation. Now, this can get pretty complex, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. So again, we have some problem we're trying to solve using large language models. And basically, this problem might not be able to be solved just from the large language model itself. Like suppose you're some sort of business and you have maybe some documents that kind of describe the onboarding process. Now, if the employee has some question about the onboarding process and they want to ask the large language model, it itself wouldn't really be able to do that because it wouldn't have the appropriate context in order to understand. But if you input the documents themselves as additional context, then the large language model at least has a chance to get the question right. So this is kind of the idea of retrieval augmented generation. In its simplest form, you can just copy and paste some text that is relevant and ask the large language model to kind of figure it out. But this can get quite a bit more complicated. You can use some programming to really automate this process, and the context can be quite large. It could be a mountain of documents or something like this. If you want to learn more about it, I'd advise you to check out a previous video of mine, and you can see the link for that in the description below. All right, so my next tip is to use an API. Now, an API allows you to access the large language model from your favorite programming language. Mine's Python, by the way, as you can maybe tell from the hat. But anyways, really using the API is the key to automation. And automation really opens the door to a bunch of kind of very useful and very powerful applications of large language models. Now, I listed a few of the choices you have for APIs. So there's a lot of big companies working hard to produce these models. And if you're interested in seeing a few more, I'll link a video in the description for you to check that out. But anyways, in this picture here, I put kind of a code block, a code sample of using an API. This is from OpenAI. And you can see it's actually not super complex. It's only a few lines of code. So it's not super difficult to get involved in using the APIs. However, there is a bit of a learning curve, so I will warn you of that. All right, so congrats on making it through the 5 tips. But congrats on making it through the 5 tips. But I figured I might as well give you a bonus tip while we're here. So the bonus tip is to use meta prompting. So basically, you have large language models generate the prompts for you. So again, you might have some problem you want to solve, and you want the large language model to solve it, but you don't know how to ask it. So one way to do this is to actually ask the large language model to provide the prompt for you. Now this is pretty interesting. It really maybe could simplify things if it works well. And you could go ahead and try it. Here you can kind of see I put some code from Anthropic's meta prompting guide. So they have a whole guide on how to do this effectively, and I'll link that in the description below. All right, so what can we take away from all this? Well, what people are finding, including myself, is that large language models are powerful tools. They can solve a variety of problems that are, pretty challenging, and they can automate various tasks away that weren't really available for automation before they were around. However, using them is pretty tricky. You have to kind of be aware of how to massage the prompts in order to get, the response you want. And I just provided a few techniques that are pretty effective, but this is by no means a complete list. And you also probably have to make use of something like a programming language in order to access the API and to really make full use of them. All right, so that's it for this video. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.